So anybody who knows me knows that I am absolutely fascinated by King Henry VIII. The Tudor dynasty is one of the most interesting stories in history. Once I started to dip my toes into the story, I could not stop. I've read countless books, watched documentaries, movies, you name it, because I am so fascinated. I went to London for the first time, 10 years ago. And I made a beeline to Hampton Court Palace because I needed to go and see the palace that he lived in, to see where all of this history happened. It was absolutely fascinating to this. So when Starz came out with these mini series based on the Tudor history, I was all in. So Philippa Gregory is author of what they call historical fiction. And so historical fiction is based on historical facts, but the author does take some creative license. So some of the things might be stretched a little bit. They might have, they might eliminate certain characters, or they might create a composite character. So it'll be two characters and they'll turn it into one for the purpose of brevity or just to make the story simpler. They will get into the heads of the characters, so to speak, adding dialogue and thought process and all these things. But they're all surrounding the pillars of history and different things that actually happen in history. So authors like Philippa Gregory, she'll write a book about a time period. She won't make up a case, she won't make up events, but what she'll do is she'll build some character development around the events. And this is why I really enjoy her, because you can trust that the pillars are there, but from a creative point of view and from a good narration point of view, she gives you a peek inside of the minds based on her historical research. Again, she's not just pulling this out of the air. It makes logical sense if you study the characters and you put the pieces together. It makes sense, but it's so entertaining. It's informative. So anyway, so Starz a couple of years ago came out with these mini series that were based on her books, and she's written a bunch of them. The one you're probably the most familiar with is The Other Boleyn Girl. That was actually turned into a movie starring Scarlett Johansson and Natalie Portman. Great movie. I watched the movie, I read the book, a little bit, some differences in there, but both were absolutely fascinating. So when Starz came out with this series, I was all in. So the first one, so we're in the third installation, if you will. So the first one was called The White Queen. That one was based in the 1400s, and so it was based on a character named Elizabeth Woodville. She was a commoner who ended up marrying King Edward IV. So this was really a big deal because at the time, all royalty were betrothed to each other from birth. People got married to form alliances. Royalty only married royalty. So the fact that he married a commoner was a big deal. It was a scandal, it was taboo, and it was one of the first times it's recorded in history. So it tells the story of Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV and what happens when they get married. They went on to have like 11 or 12 children. One of their children, their first daughter actually, is also named Elizabeth. She became the principal character for the second installation, which was called The White Princess. So it goes on about why her marriage was set up the way it was. So they betrothed her to King Henry VII, who is King Henry VIII's father. And the reason is because there was this war going on. It's a really long story, so just trying to summarize it, what they were trying to do was to unite the country. And so they had two warring families, if you will. And so they thought the best way to do this is to marry them together. This way, everybody in the country will be on board because they either support one or the other. So Elizabeth of York her marriage to King Henry VII was that unifying factor. They went on to have several children. One of those children was King Henry VIII, and that's the person who, most people are familiar with, the one who had 6 wives, who beheaded 2 of them. There's a million stories about him and a whole bunch of depictions of who he was. Some, I think, are exaggerated, some are probably based in truth, and there's a lot of room in the middle. That brings us to The Spanish Princess, which is the show that just started last night. And this is the second season, which premiered on on Stars. So the Spanish Princess is about King Henry VIII's first wife. We know he goes on to have 5 more. We know that Anne Boleyn is probably one of the most famous ones. That's the one the other Bowling Girl movie is based on, and she was one who was executed by her husband. Whole other story. That's a whole other video, and it's fascinating, and I want to talk about it, but that's comes later, right? So the Spanish Princess is about King Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So give you a little bit of background. Henry was the second son of his children. So the way it worked in royalty is the firstborn son is the one who would then inherit the throne. The second son was almost like a backup. The only way that son would ever become king is if something happened to his older brother. And that's exactly what happened with King Henry VIII. His older brother Arthur died at the age of 15 or 16, which wasn't uncommon at the time. And when he died, King Henry then became the heir apparent, and he then became the next in line for the throne, and eventually he did become king. So Catherine of Aragon is, she's from Spain. Her mother is the queen of one part of Spain. Her father is the king of another part of Spain. This is before Spain was one country. And so there were 2 different regions that made up the whole country of Spain. And her parents were king and queen of both of those places. So she was extremely powerful, or I guess she had a lot of value in the sense that she was royalty on both sides. So typically what happens is somebody will marry into royalty. But her father was a king in his own right, and her mother was a queen in her own right. So she was royalty on both ends, which made her extremely valuable. She also came from Spain. At that time, in the late 1400s, the early 1500s, everything was about alliances. There were a couple of major powers in Europe. You know, you had France, you had Spain, you have Germany, you have England, you have Scotland. And a lot of times their preservation was based on alliances. They needed to partner up with other superpowers, if you will, in order to remain safe, in order to acquire land, all of those things. It made, a lot of times marriages were about alliances. They were saying, okay, I am, you know, the king of Austria, and I have a daughter. I'm going to betroth her to the, you know, the son of the king of France, so that now Austria and France are aligned and we are a superpower in and of ourselves. So that was the way things went. England wanted to create an alliance with Spain. Spain wanted to create an alliance with England, so they decided to betroth their children. Arthur, which was the oldest child of the King Henry VII, and his wife, who's Elizabeth of York, who is the main character of The White Princess. I know I'm going a little fast, it's a lot of information, but I'm gonna put up a diagram so this all makes sense later. So what you're looking at is a simplified version of the Tudor family tree. There are a lot more people that could be added to this. There were a lot of other children, a lot of siblings, but for the purpose of this video, I wanted to keep it simple so you can understand who I'm talking about and who the characters are in these 3 installations of these shows. So the first one is The White Queen, and that was based on Elizabeth Woodville, who married King Edward IV. Elizabeth was a commoner, she married a king. They went on and had about 11 children. Their eldest daughter, also named Elizabeth, who was known in history as Elizabeth of York, is the main character for the second installation, which is called The White Princess. Elizabeth of York was married to King Henry VII. And again, this was a strategic marriage to bring these 2 families together to unite the country. They went on to have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The 2 boys are the ones of interest. We have Arthur, who's their eldest, who was raised to be the heir to the throne, and his younger brother, King Henry VIII. Arthur dies young, and before he dies, he had actually been married to Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine is the daughter of 2 of the kings, or the king and the queen of Spain. So he marries Catherine, he dies, she becomes a widow, and in order for her to remain in England and for her to fulfill her destiny of becoming the Queen of England, she negotiates or manipulates a deal so that she could marry King Henry VIII, Arthur's little brother. And this is where we step into the story of the Spanish princess, and it talks all about the marriage between King Henry and his first wife, his first of 6 wives, Catherine of Aragon. You have King Henry VII and his wife. They have a son, Arthur. That's their oldest son. They betrothed their son to Catherine of Aragon, who I explained before is from Spain, and both of her parents are royalty. So from the time both of these people were children, they were betrothed to each other. Before they could even probably speak, they knew that they were destined to marry each other. You fast forward in time, they're probably 15, 16 years old, which was common marrying age back then. And it's time for Catherine to come to England, because that's how it worked. The woman would go to the man, and she would go to his country, and she would become the next Queen of England. She goes to England, she meets Arthur. Long story short, they get married, and he dies shortly after. So again, remember, these people are young. Arthur's 14, 15, she's probably around the same age. So she becomes a widow as a teenager. So now she's in England. She's there basically, and now she's just a widow. They haven't had any children yet. So in a sense, she doesn't really have much value anymore, right? What happens is they decide to betroth her to their next son, who later becomes Henry VIII. So again, his older brother died, so now he's the next in line for the throne. They betroth him to Catherine. Some people would say this is a little sketchy because that was his brother's wife. Again, this is not uncommon in those times. And as long as the marriage had not been consummated, meaning they did not have sex, then it was technically okay. Now, that's one of those things that goes on in history. Nobody knows whether or not Arthur and Catherine ever consummated their relationship. It's likely they were married for several months, but there's really no proof of it. Catherine, having been raised to believe that she's destined to become the Queen of England, she wants to stay in England. She wants to still become queen. She does a little, I don't want to say manipulating, but a little negotiating or whatever you want to call it, so that she can become betrothed to Arthur's little brother, Henry VIII. And it works. Eventually, the two of them get married. There was a lot of strife moving up to that point, and all of this is covered in The White Princess, which was that second series. But as we move on to this current series, they are now married, and they appear to be extremely happy. So when the series starts, it's 1511, something like that, early 1500s. The two of them are married. They have a son. They seem to be doing extremely well. They seem to be really in love. They have an heir, which was a huge thing at the time. You know, you needed to have an heir. You needed to have a male heir. So she's given him a son. You know, the people of England love her. She's embracing her role as the Queen of England. Everything seems to be going well. Then what we do is we introduce her father. Sometime prior to this, her mother had already passed away. Her father, who was King Ferdinand of Aragon, which is in Spain, he comes to England to see her and to see, well, I think this might even be the first time he's in England, comes to see her, to meet Henry, her husband, and to meet his grandchild. He comes, it's a big to-do. You can tell that Catherine is a little anxious, you know, and you don't really understand why at the time, but we get this, we realize later, her father's pretty much an asshole. And if you watch the series before this, you see signs of this, because when she went to Europe and the first marriage didn't work out, they were ready to send her back, but her father didn't want her to come back. So you saw some evidence back there that he wasn't a benevolent, loving father. And at that time, that wasn't uncommon, because people did see their children as negotiating pieces and pawns. I'm not to say people didn't love their children, but you know, their children were means of negotiating and means of, like I said, creating alliances with other countries. So it wasn't so much the lovey-dovey relationship you see now between parents and children. It was more about, okay, this is your duty as our child to create a union or create an alliance with another nation. Along those lines, he didn't want her to come back. I guess he didn't see any value in her. It's like, now who am I going to marry her off to? So you get a little backstory there. So when he comes to England, we see it. He's just like kind of a hater, you know. He's taking jabs at England. He's making comparisons, you know, trying to imply that things are better in Spain, or that they have as much as they have in England. It's an uncomfortable place for Catherine, because again, she's trying to appease her father, but she's also now the Queen of England. She wants to appease her husband, and they also want to create an alliance with Spain. Apparently they have beef with France, and they need Spain's troops and they need Spain's support in order to beat the French. So this visit is not only a reunion of father and daughter, but it's also a diplomatic venture, if you will, because Catherine wants to create an alliance between the two countries, and they need to get her father to give the okay or the consent to align and to also attack France. So that's really what they're trying to get out of this meeting. He comes, it all seems to go well, you know, but you kind of see there's something going on behind the scenes. There's some contention, and Catherine handles it extremely well. You know, she is trying to be diplomatic. She's trying to keep her loyalty to her husband and her new country, but also be a good daughter. She ends up convincing her father to align with England. And everybody's happy. Henry is thrilled. He's thinking, you know, my wife she just got me a whole other army. She's got me an alliance with another country. She's giving me a little baby boy. She's giving me an heir. Everything is just perfect. You know, again, they're young. They're probably in their 20s. He's a young king, you know, probably bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, optimistic about the future. They seem to be really in love. Everything seems to be going great. We learn later that her father, being the hater that he is, reneged on their deal. So he said that, you know, hey, you know, meet me out here. We're going to meet. We're going to go together and we're going to attack France. They go out to the place to wait for all the Spanish ships. The Spanish ships never show up. Come to find out, he took his ships to another direction and left them hanging out there looking stupid and making Catherine look really bad because she negotiated this deal. Her father sends her a letter and basically says, yeah, you know, I lied to you. Like, that's just charge it to the game. That's kind of how these things work. You'll be all right. This does something for her. It kind of turns a knob where she gets it. Like, I think she knew who her father was, but she was trying to be optimistic because, you know, she's young. She wanted this all to work out. But at the end of the day, her father is the same trifling person he was before. So she, in a sense, kind of writes him off. And in her speeches to the English people, she says that she is now considering herself an English woman. You know, forget Spain. They did us dirty. My father did us dirty. It's all good. We're still going to go invade France. We got this. So it's a big, you know, big moment. Everybody's all hyped up. You know, they're all God save the queen. Everybody's all excited about her. Then their son, who at this time seems like he's probably like, I don't know, 8 weeks old or something, he dies. I don't know why. I'm sure it's in the history book somewhere. I know a lot of children died young back then. It wasn't uncommon. Obviously, she and her husband go into great mourning. This was their first son. This was their heir. It's their child. And it's a hard time for both of them. But they're a young couple. They're in love. It brings them closer together, it seems. They talk about how much they love each other and how they're going to try again. They're going to have another kid. And Henry seems extremely supportive of his wife and everything that she's going through. And it seems like they're destined for some greatness. However, if you follow these stories, you know that this is probably the beginning of the end. Catherine would go on to have several more pregnancies and only have one living child, who is Mary, Princess Mary, who becomes queen for a short period of time in the late 1500s. But having a son is the most important thing. And what you'll see is that Henry's disposition of all his wives seems to be about, I need to get a male heir, and if you can't get that for me, I have to move on to the next one and hope that she gives me a male heir. And that was part of the breakdown, the downfall, I should say, of Anne Boleyn, because she was incapable of giving him a son. This was the first episode. Again, it started off really nice and sunny and bright. Now we start to see things fall apart. We start to see the writing on the wall of how Catherine and Henry, their relationship is going to deteriorate. He's going to start looking outside the marriage. He will have a kid outside of their marriage at some point. It's going to get really ugly and it's going to get bad for Catherine. So this right here, episode 1, was probably the best that we're going to see, and the happiest we will see them together. And then from here on in, we're going to start to see how things are going to start to go left. But I thought it was excellent, extremely well done. It really laid out all the characters. So if you follow, you know, there are some major players in here. There's Cardinal Wolsey and there's Thomas More, and there's just a whole bunch of characters that later become important to the story, or who you definitely see later on, and we see them all as young people right now. Charles Brandon, his Princess Mary, Princess Margaret, who is now the Queen of Scotland. It's a lot to follow, but it's really fascinating. I love to go back in time and look at characters back then before they became who they are, or before you start to realize the stories that they're popular for when they're just regular people. It's like Henry. I mean, he turns out later on to be this tyrant who kills two of his wives and who does all these horrible things. But as we see him now, he's a young man who's in love. And he's a young man who has just, inherited the throne, and he really wants to be a good prince for his country, and he wants to do the right thing, and he has all the great ideals. And you'll get to see over time how, just like all of us, we all start out with the best of intentions, but then after a while, life starts to take a toll and things change. And we start to see that happen to Henry as time goes on. But it was really nice to see the best of him, and to see the layers of him, and to see that he wasn't born this monster that history makes him out to be. That, there were some circumstances along the way that created the person that we all are familiar with. So it was really good. I am thrilled. I'm excited to see what else happens. I mean, I know the story, I've read some of the books, but just to see it play out, to see what kind of creative license they're going to take with it. The actors are good. The one who plays, I don't know her name, but the actress who plays Catherine of Aragon and the actor who plays King Henry VIII, they are excellent. They have really good on-screen chemistry. The writing is good. So it's exciting. So I'm just waiting to see what happens next. I know it's going to get pretty dark. So I'm looking forward to it, and I would love to hear what you guys think. And if you guys are out there watching it as well, we can have some discussion about all these characters and everything that's happening. So that's pretty much it. So I will review next week's, and I'll talk to you then.